This is Ron Peters.
I'm Sam Long.
And I'm John Nugent.
Welcome to the After Class Podcast.
Because the best conversations happen
after class.
Thanks for joining us on another episode of the After Class Podcast. We're glad to have you along. We talked about last week kind of end of semester activities that were fun. I want to talk a little bit about one that highlights our students that I wouldn't say it's not fun, but it's a little different, a little more academic in nature. Yeah. Each year we have a capstone class here called Senior Seminar, and seniors are required to do a capstone project of their choosing. They kind of pick a topic they want to research and investigate, and it's always kind of a joy to allow our students who have been with us, 3, 4, 5 years to, showcase what they've learned and their critical thinking and their writing skills and presentation skills. And so they bring that to bear, and we spend a whole day just going from presentation to presentation and just allowing them to share what they've researched and learned. And so that happened, by the time this comes out, it'll probably be like 2 months ago. But no, a couple of weeks ago for us. So just want to get your all's impressions of how you thought it went and what you found interesting.
Yeah, I love Senior Showcase for the very things you said there, Sam, that they do this massive research project, but that's just them writing a paper, and the only person who really reads it is their advisor. And this is an opportunity for them to say, oh, I'm going to present this. I'm going to present it to a group, and they're going to have to listen, and at the end they can ask questions. And, most of us have done plenty of papers and scholarly conferences. We know what that feels like. But for students, for many of them, this is their first opportunity to do something like that. And most of them are terrified. They're just like, oh, this is going to be horrible. And I try to explain it to them over and over in class. It's like, I understand that it's scary. I don't blame you for that. But I want you to get some experience so that this can become your normal. You can get used to it. And we always have a session afterwards where we talk about it. And almost every one of them says the same thing. I was scared getting started. The first minute or two were really bad. But once I got into it, I felt pretty good. I'm like, I'm so glad to hear you. Hold on to that because you're going to probably do this in the future. And it might not be the same format, but I want you to get used to talking in front of people. And this year we heard a lot of good papers. And I was really, really impressed by the number of students who came out to hear their fellow students present. Every now and then you'll get a couple people who draw a crowd. But this year, almost every presentation had a crowd. And so it was really interesting to see how many of our underclassmen came out to support and listen to the graduating seniors. And so for me, that was one of the highlights. I was just so glad that it was such a community experience for us.
Yeah, I really enjoy the advising part of it. We get paired up with students, and some of you may have had multiple students, but it's a mentoring process, right? This is like the paper they're going to put more energy into than anything else they do. And so they take their drafts very seriously. They take your feedback very seriously, because more so than any other class, because they're going to have to stand in front of a group and they don't know who's going to be there.
Yeah. And
they're going to have to present, and they have to know it well enough to be able to field questions. And so they're not faking it this time. They really
Exactly.
want to understand it. They really want to write it well so they can present it well so that they can survive the scrutiny. So I really enjoy the mentoring process of that, and I really enjoyed this year. I got to work with Kara Caswell, and she did a great paper on Sabbath, and like we talked about the last episode, and she comes from a faith tradition that practices Sabbath every Saturday, right? And they do preparation the evening before, and she's at Great Lakes is a tradition that doesn't focus on Saturdays in the same way. And so she found a way to talk about Sabbath from a full Bible perspective that has relevance no matter what Christian tradition you're part of. And it was great watching her critically work through the complexity of the issue and come out with some practical suggestions that apply to everyone, no matter your church background. So I was really proud of her, and I really enjoyed the process.
Yeah, bittersweet for me in a way, because I had 4 papers that I was.
That is a heavy load.
Which is that's a bit. Man, did they crush it. They just knocked it out of the park. All 4 of their presentations were very strong. They had papers to back them up. I was enormously pleased by what they did. And then I went, oh no, I'm not going to have them in class anymore. They are just, and they're powerful, all 4 of them, powerful presences in the class. They're just mature people. I respect them as ministers. I had a children's ministry, 2 youth ministry, and a senior ministry presentation. So I just spent my day listening to people reflect on how to be good ministers in the church. That was just a beautiful day.
Yeah.
Yeah, as a former full-time minister, it was nice to hear like, oh, this is the next generation of ministers, and they're thinking very thoughtfully about what it's going to look like, and it's important. And
Yeah.
I agree with you. Their presentation is very like, okay, they're getting there. They realize what's ahead of them, and they need to they can't keep doing church the same way. And so I appreciated those very much, and Cares as well. I told her I'm probably going to have to utilize some of her paper in my book that I'm writing in the spring, like this idea of what, because it was really well done and very thoughtful and really looked at the original materials in a very reflective way.
Yeah, and I think it illustrates the good and the bad about graduation because at Senior Showcase you really see them at their best, and you're so proud of them, and you just want to give them the that cheerleader moment, and then you realize we're losing our best people, our best students. They're graduating, and that's what's supposed to happen. There's supposed to be a commencement where they take the next step and commence with the next stage of your life. And I'm happy for them, but I'm sad for us because every fall it's like a bunch of people are missing, and you miss them. You want to see them around. Even introverts like me and Sam still miss people. Going back to our last episode, it doesn't mean we don't love people. And so, yeah, Senior Showcase is bittersweet for that reason.
So a few more things to go in the end of the semester, but it's a good one. You always know after that, sort of like, okay, it's pretty much downhill from here.
Yeah, for real.
Yep, like the last several weeks, we were joined again by Professor Todd Jones, who teaches Christian ministries here at Great Lakes, and he's been leading us through Richard Foster's book, Celebration of Discipline, and helping us work through various Christian disciplines. What's up for us today, Todd?
Cue the ominous organ music. We're going to be talking about the discipline of submission.
Dun,
Dun, dun, dun. I know John and I did the same thing.
Drew's, our sound technician's probably going to override what we just did. With,
Put something
we'll
really
see, Drew.
ominous in.
The challenge is before you, Drew.
Well, this is a critically important discipline. And quite frankly, the Bible addresses it many times and in many different ways. And so I'm really glad that we have the opportunity to address it. And also, there's just a lot of ways this can go wrong. And so before we even begin with our usual method of taking a look at Foster's definitions and working our way through defining what the discipline is, I actually think it's appropriate to spend a moment. We're going to use some of Foster's words again, but spend a moment talking about what submission is not. Because I genuinely believe there will be some listeners out there, as soon as you hear submission, you will think, oh, I know, what this table full of men is going to say, and that like that. There are legitimately earned scars that people have about this topic. And so we want to establish, first of all, what we're not saying before we start trying to say anything.
How does one legitimately earn a scar?
So in psychological terms, these are not imagined injuries. Like,
So they're real.
yes,
Gotcha.
they are actually hurt in reality, and they are experiencing that not as some sort of figment of their imagination. That's what I guess what I
Gotcha.
mean.
It's a funny way to say it, legitimately earns.
Sorry, very millennial
They
terminology.
deserve to be scarred. I'm like, what? I don't know. You legitimately earned that scar.
Yes, in contradistinction to faking it, it is
Yeah,
a very
gotcha.
real injury. Yeah.
A child boo-boo versus losing an arm.
Okay.
I do what I can. I'm here for you.
It's good.
Well,
I'll
that's
tell you
Sit
what.
down.
let me read a quote from Foster's book. And again, I just so appreciate. I mean, we've brought up a couple times that Foster's book is an oldie but a goodie. I mean, it has been written 40 years ago at this point. 40 years ago, he had the foresight to write these words: "Nothing can put people into bondage like religion, and nothing in religion has done more to manipulate and destroy people than a deficient teaching on submission."
That is a powerful quote. I agree.
Yeah, because it has to do with we care very deeply about leadership and power structures and this idea of when the church turns into controlling people and turns into selfishness, then it's at its worst and is probably not really the church. And so what he says is, I tried to find ways to poke holes at this, and I'm not sure I can, because he says has done more to manipulate and destroy people, like deficient teaching and submission. That's when the church is not being the church, when we're forcing people to do things that are our will and not God's will. And there are plenty of examples of that, and I think he's right on it. And again, I think the fact that this was 40 years ago is a little mind-boggling, because yes, this is of course all the rage now, but
Right, yeah.
40 years ago, we lived in a different society, right? This is the 90s and the 80s, and that's not where we were at as a church or as a society. And so, as you say, we've ripped him a lot in the series, but kudos to him for this.
Yeah. And we've talked about it a lot in this podcast. And I think that, adding to this definition, which is spot on, it's that abuse of power when people want power over others and they want to strong arm them, leverage into obeying, that the language of submission becomes the tool that you do that with. You're not submitting. I'm in charge. You're not submitting to me. A lot of times fear or threats come into that. And I've been in churches where I've watched it happening in front of me. And it all sounds so spiritual. It all sounds so biblical and so godly. And yet it's not, because it's leaving out of the story important parts that Jesus both taught us and modeled for us. Things that go back into what God was trying to instill in Israel and for them to understand what it means to be the people of God. And so, we don't want people to hear submission and all of a sudden like their shields go up and they're getting all nervous and all that. It's like, no, we want to dispel with those horrible abuses of submission so that we can understand it from a more godly perspective.
Yeah, I would just add 2 words. I would say a deficient teaching on authority and submission. I would add the authority end, because on the one hand, you have people who are told to submit, and that's a very deficient teaching, the way they're often told to submit. And other people are told that you have authority, people must submit to you. And so there's kind of 2 sides of this coin. It's the same coin. The authority coin on the other side is the submission coin. And when they're paired together in a certain way, it's toxic.
Yeah, I think this is like the cult playbook, right? Where when you talk about these religious cults, it all comes down to the prophet says this and we do it, and if you don't agree with it, you're out, right? And now that's an extreme version, but you see it play itself out in certain churches. Well, the elders have made this decision, and you need to get in line. Or the minister, the lead minister, who is he's anointed by God, and he says this, and so I guess we all, even though we're like, I don't think so. Like, well, do you believe in God's anointing or not? And all of a sudden
Right.
you're,
Yeah.
it's a little gaslighty, and turning it on you, and like, wait a minute, that we can have differing opinions, right? And in some places the answer is no. And that's where you're able to manipulate and then destroy people. And so many people have these awful stories of their growing up in these churches where it was completely ruled by a small or group of people or a person. And any challenging, they made you feel like you're less spiritual because you're not submitting to God's will. And like, is this God's will? And the answer is no, it's not.
Yeah, and not just the church. I mean, it could be a parent, it can be
Sure.
a coach, it can be a boss. Like, there are lots of people in your life that you can be told, submit to them. They're in charge of you. In this moment, in this sphere, you don't get to speak up against them. You just do what you're told.
Well, you missed one of the most important ones, which is a spouse, where there are lots
Right,
of,
right.
lots of places where say what the husband says goes. And so women have been trampled on for a long time with that very logic.
Yeah.
I hesitate to call it theology because it's
Right.
not.
Right. And that's where, we talk about cults using that, but how many situations, both in the church and outside the church and other institutions, that it's very cult-like, or is it a cult and we're just too scared to use the term? Like, we know what those cults are because those are those people who do those weird things and commit suicide and all that. But when other people are doing it, whether it's churches or families, like you said, Sam, or other institutions, why don't we call them a cult? Because you're using the same techniques. And maybe people aren't like killing themselves, or maybe you're not preventing them from leaving, but you're using that same technique. And you can call it a cult or cult-like or whatever, but it's the same problem.
Less Kool-Aid.
Right, yeah.
And tennis shoes.
So the challenge of this episode then is to recognize that the Bible nonetheless calls us to submit to different parties. And we're trying to get at what is that. If God's calling us to do it, it's not something that's for our oppression.
Right.
It's for the reason he calls us to do anything else, which is for our thriving and for our witness.
Yeah, definitely. And so rather than going through like an exhaustive list of all of the deficient teachings that have been offered, which would take a long time, we can reference another Foster quote that I think really gets at what John was just saying too. He says the next paragraph on that page, the disciplines are for the purpose of realizing a greater good. In and of themselves, they are no value whatever. They have value only as a means of setting us before God so he can give us the liberation we seek. This is that way of thriving, the way of life. That the disciplines are meant to be drawing us closer to God, which is closer to life and closer to goodness. And so if they're drawing us away, then we're doing them wrong by definition, or they're being corrupted or manipulated or destroyed. Again, rather than focusing deeply on all of the ways that it can be deficient, let's do some work to try and define like what is a sufficient teaching on submission, and then this thing that, as John's pointed out, we are encouraged to do. How do we do it right? So let's take a look at Foster's first definition. I think this definition is informed by the danger. He says, submission is self-denial without self-hatred.
Yeah, it's not. Well, I mean, I have to die to self, but you don't have to die exactly to self in that way, right? It's about a choice, right? Where I'm choosing to deny self, but at the same time, that doesn't mean I now hate myself or hate my views on things. It's a conscious choice for my betterment, for the betterment of the body. It's not. No, it's not. Are we in the communal? We're not in communal
outward
practices yet. It's outward, but not communal. But it seems like there's a communal aspect to it.
Yeah, I'm thinking about that definition. I'm not trying to find fault with him. I'm just saying that it seems like there's something that's still a little bit missing there, because submission is a communal thing. There are other people to whom I submit. And so I think submission is not just hating self, but also not hating the people around us that we're submitting to. Because I think that's what happens to a lot of people, like the really toxic effects of a lot of that submission teaching is you don't just hate yourself, but you hate the people around you because of what they're doing to you. And so even though I think Foster's doing a good job, I would want to expand that a little bit to say, you don't want to end up hating these people. If you are, there's something wrong here. We've got to have a conversation. Abuses of power again, or things like that. So, like I said, I'm kind of stretching it out a little bit more.
Yeah, you submit not because you think you have a bad idea or their idea is superior necessarily. Like that's the first part. The second, I think the next definition is going to flesh that out more. But it's not just about like I need to think less of myself and like, oh, I must really suck, and that's why we're not going to go with my way. Like that's not what we're talking about.
Yeah, and I think what you have down here is definitions. They're not necessarily what does the word submit mean, but they're kind of like submission entails. Mm-hmm. Like there's a level of self-denial involved in submission, but that shouldn't be confused with self-hatred.
Yeah.
Right? But what the submission itself is, I think it presumes that you're allowing someone else to take the lead in a certain area. Like recognizing that there are other people who have been given responsibility to steward a certain area, and you happen to be in that area, but you're not the one who's been entrusted with that responsibility. It's accepting the fact that God sometimes picks other people to be responsible for an area, and you have to allow them to lead. Specifically, you're told to submit because even though they're not perfect, even though they're not going to do everything the way you would do it, and even though they might not do everything the way you would like it, it's still their responsibility to steward and not yours.
Yeah, I'm very on board with that understanding and that way of describing it. My mind sometimes thinks in pictures, and so when I imagine submission in three-dimensional space, I think our instinct is to think submission means I lower myself below other people. I'm submitting by taking myself lower. And I think what Foster and what I want to say about this is self-denial, rather like that. What I just described as self-hatred. I lower myself because if I want it, it must be bad, or something like that. Self-denial is to elevate everybody else to where they actually are supposed to be. Like my gut instinct, my default setting is to make them lower than where they belong, make them lower than how God sees them, or make them lower than the position that where they're supposed to be. And so it's actually in the three-dimensional space kind of image. Submission is like elevating them, like pulling them up to where they actually are, and then behaving accordingly. It's like acknowledging the truth of the matter, that this isn't my responsibility. I've not been given authority over this. I'm going to submit, because there is the, like Romans 13 being this kind of classic example where we're given specific instructions to submit to governing authorities that execute this sort of justice for these purposes. We do that because that's not our job. That job has been handed to them by God. And so it's an act of submission to God to submit to them, which is putting things in their proper order rather than lowering myself below the government to make sure that I'm where I belong, under the boot. That's a
Right.
self-hatred.
Yeah, I've heard there are flashing lights outside the window, but it's apparently a utility vehicle. We always get nervous when we see flashing lights on campus. Who's being arrested this time? No.
Is it Ron again? Ugh.
Well, I'm under my desk right now.
Like a bailing
No,
out.
they're coming after me. I hate myself.
Yeah, I think those are important kind of framings. And I read an article on submission, and maybe you can clarify this, Ron. And is it hupotasso? Is that the Greek word?
Yeah, hupotasso, right?
That it was a study of hupotasso in multiple different ancient Greek manuscripts, and not just the Bible, not just how it's used in the New Testament. And the way it defined it is, it's not necessarily put yourself under, as much as recognize your place in the organization that you find yourself as a part of. Like, live out your role in the order. And in different aspects of life, like in the home, if you're a parent, your place in the order is you are responsible for your children to look after your well-being, and you're going to have to make certain decisions that they're going to have to live with. In your parents' household, you're recognizing your place as being that they're the ones who are entrusted with the household that you're a child in, and they have responsibility that they have to answer to God for, right? And so submitting is just recognizing your place in the order. And if you're in a position where you've been given responsibility for, well, you're someone, like I think of Jesus' conversation with Pilate. Jesus wouldn't be standing before Pilate if God hadn't placed Pilate, right, in a position to govern, political affairs out of Jerusalem, right? Like, there is an order of which God is at the top, and in any different life situation, there are people who are given responsibility, and there are people over whom they have responsibility, and it's just discerning your place within that, and it's not always going to be in the same spot. And there's a certain way of living that is appropriate and fitting to your place in that organization. And the church is tricky because, we're told in Ephesians, submit to one another. So the church is a certain kind of order that is not structured in the kind of hierarchy, say, that the Roman Empire is. And so submitting within the church context is always in the context of a body where there's mutual submission, whereas that's not necessarily how the Roman Empire sets up their hierarchy. Mm-hmm. And so I think we get confused if we mistake the contexts.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I feel like I have something to say, but I have not gathered my thoughts together. Like, it's there in my head, but the words aren't coming out, so I was leaning in to speak, and I realized I got nothing to say.
Well, I'm waiting for the second definition. I think that, for me, brings more out.
Yeah, I think John segued us to it nicely, because his second definition is deferation. What did I just say? Don't look at words while you're also trying to say words. Second definition: liberation from the need to get your way, which is implying, I think, all the stuff that John just said, that there is an order, and you have the ability at any given time to resist that order, to fight against your place in that order by demanding more than your fair share, so to speak. You have the opportunity to do that. I see this with my toddler all the time, trying to exert his will on our household, and he is able to do that because that's how human freedom looks in practice. He's wrong for doing that. And there is a gradual process by which we teach him about that incorrectness, and he hopefully will settle into his proper place in the home, and then everyone will be liberated from this. Our authority as his parents will be respected, and his position as beloved child will be honored, and we will exist in harmony. Liberation from the need to get your way is in part just that I'm recognizing that I'm not in charge, So I get to experience the freedom of not being in charge and
Yeah.
let someone else be in charge.
Yeah, I think this is for me where it bridges the gap between the wrong usage of submission and more appropriate usage. I mean, we live in a society where should always get your way, and if you're not getting your way, something's wrong. Which of course is ludicrous because everyone can't always get their way, or it's anarchy, and yet that's what we're told. And so the church comes along and says, well, no, like you're getting your way. That comes from a selfish place. And so part of submission, I think, is to address the selfishness that we all struggle with. To say, well, why must it be your way? Because you think it's the best, because you think it's the right way, or because it's yours, and that's most important. And so the challenge then is to say, okay, I need to rethink, like, why do I want this so badly? And if it's a truth thing, if it's a matter of like what is true and right and good, that's one thing. But if it's this is what I want done, then it's not. And so talking about the different abuses, like we did at the beginning, like so often, like some people don't even get a chance to put it forth. It's like, no, this person's way is it, and everyone else must fall in line. And this addresses that and say even the person at the very top, well, like you said, whatever context you find yourself in, the person at the top still needs to think about, is my way the most important, or is the right way most important, whatever way or thing or decision you're making?
Yeah, I think about the abuses of power where everybody's told they must submit, but the person making that argument isn't asking, himself or herself important questions of, am I just mad because I'm not getting my way? I just want my way. And I'm sure the person in charge thinks, well, my way is the best way and all that. But if you're not willing to listen to people bring forth some legitimate concerns about that, it's just, I want my way. And, submission says, I don't got to have my way. It makes me think of, even in 1 Corinthians 13, talking about, people exercising their spiritual gifts, and Paul binds it all together with love. And he says, part of the definition of love is not feeling like you got to get your way. And so that rejection of power, and especially the rejection of the abuse of power, is tied to that really essential commitment. And again, we can make arguments for our way. We can have conversations with people about why we think this is the best way. That's great. That's how the body functions. But when that begins to degenerate into, I have to have my way, and I'm going to beat you over the head with submission so that I get my way, well, no, we've got a problem there. Again, pastors do it, spouses do it, bosses do it in the workplace, politicians do it. This is just everywhere in society. I think it's part of the problem that God is trying to fix. When the church embraces it, we become part of the problem instead of part of the solution.
Yeah, I like this second kind of refinement of the definition because I think it is liberating. It's liberating to know you're not in charge of the world. You're not in charge of everything. There are certain places in your life where you can just go with the flow, right? And you're not the one responsible, so you're not the one who has to make the decisions, and it doesn't have to go the way you think is best. Like, that's extremely liberating. I know 3 of us around the table have served as VPAA at the college. Yeah, there are times when, most recently Sam was VPAA, and before him Ron was, and now I am. And it's liberating that Sam was in charge of academics during COVID, because Rod and I were just very grateful. Like, Sam is the one who's going to talk to all the other Vs, talk to the president, follow, what are the laws of the land? Like, what is the best way for our school to handle this? And they're going to come up with something, and they're going to tell us, and we're going to submit. We're going to say, it's kind of your responsibility to herd all of us cattle, and all of the students in an organized way. And that's a lot of work. That's a lot of burden to figure it out. And it was our pleasure to let you take the lead, and it was liberating that we didn't have
I agree.
deal with all that stuff. It didn't feel all that liberating for you
at the time
to have to make the decisions. But in that way, it's just very freeing to be in space where it's not all on you. And if things go wrong, no one's going to look at you. They're going to look at the person who's been given responsibility. And I don't like language of in charge.
Sure.
Just because in charge usually means I get to unilaterally decide, right? I make the decisions for everyone else. You have to do what I say. I like responsibility because I think how the New Testament uses the word charge, like elders in the church, care for, the people in your congregation that are in your charge. Charge is not that you have power over and control over, but it's like the group of people. Your charge is the group of people that God has assigned to you a responsibility. And it's those people and not those outside of. So if you're a leader in one church, your charge is the congregation that gathers, together as a body. There's another church down the street, with a different set of leaders, and those people are their charge, right? But it's not describing the kind of relationship I'm in charge, but like the limits on the number of people that you have responsibility for.
I really appreciate. I was thinking something similar about the first part about the freedom of it all. Just confession time. I came to college very immature, thinking I was always right, and that's a lot to constantly think you're right. Because then what do you have to do? You have to defend everything, right?
Yeah.
And you're constantly fighting and correcting people, and it's a lot, and it's not good. It's not healthy spiritually or for relationships, because no one likes to be around someone who thinks they're always right. And like maturity made me figure out I may still think I'm right, but who gives a crap whether I think, Star Wars 2 is better than Star Wars 1? Or like, who cares, right? And so the freeing aspect of like, I don't have to impose my will on anyone. I don't want to impose my opinion on anyone. If they think differently, so be it. I think they're wrong and stupid, but that it doesn't matter, right?
Yeah.
So it frees me to like, and this is, I think, the thing is it allows us to agree to disagree and still be friends. And I think that's part of the problem in a society where we're unable to separate those things out. And so it's not like, no, I'm right, and I need to push this all the way to the limit. And that's why people are constantly at each other's throats. And no one can say, like, okay, cool. Yeah, I'm glad you think that. I'm out. And so there is a really freeing aspect that took me a long time, way too long, to embrace because, I had a penchant for being correct and right all the time. And submission says, don't have to be. And that's okay.
Yeah.
No, I love that. And I agree with you because, part of the freedom of that is the adventure of learning new things. It's like if you're always right, it's like I know everything I need to know and I don't need to change and I'm just going to bend everybody to my will. But man, when you realize that there's this whole world of stuff that I haven't learned yet and the excitement of when I learn something new and it challenges my world, how am I going to reorient my thinking to accommodate this new information that is surprising and exciting? And like you, Sam, there was a time when I couldn't handle that. I had to fight and I had to be right and all that. But I think through our education especially, we begin to learn that there's just so much more out there. And it's so exciting. And what you're doing is you're submitting to this new information. Instead of fighting it, you're like, oh, that's really interesting. Let's think about this for a while. And you learn to make friends with things that you thought were your enemies. But it takes you to these sort of new and glorious realms. And so submission can be this really beautiful thing of taking us to places we never thought we'd go before.
Yeah, in my experience with thinking I'm right all the time.
Wow, I wonder if it's unique to us.
Something about this profession maybe attracts that personality. I don't know, but I had the same exact struggle. Maybe in some ways still do. I think that just defaulting to the assumption that I'm right is actually a control measure. I want to be in control of my own life, circumstances, whatever. I want to be right so that I don't have to consider you. I want to be right so that you can just sort of get in line behind me and I don't have to be inconvenienced by your wants or needs. Mm-hmm. Like there's a control element to that, I think, which is what makes that instruction that we get in Ephesians that, we submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. That is a high calling. It requires awareness of every person in our charge, as John, two similar names. As John was talking earlier, the people in our charge or the people under whom we are the charge, we have to have awareness of everyone. If we're submitting it to one another, to all of the one another's around us, we have to have awareness of them. And if I'm right all the time, I don't have to be aware. I just have to be articulate. And that's easier. That's easier to do, I think. So to submit yourself to a group, to submit yourself to the nature of the church and the unity, beauty that is formed out of mutual submission requires awareness of the other and requires you to lay down your preferences. So I want to ask a question. This is a classroom question too. And it may be, let me just ask it, whatever. Is it more important for the church to do things efficiently, or to do things really wisely, or for the church to be unified?
So it's a forced choice wisely.
I think
Sorry,
efficiently and wisely are categorized. Those are in parallel.
those are one.
Yeah, let's just say, is it more important to be
Gotcha.
efficient or to be unified? Let's cut wisdom out of there. Just cut it out.
Well, there's the right answer, and there's
And of course, we know that you have the right answer, Sam, because you're always right.
Yeah. Of course, forced choice. The answer is yes. We want to do both, I would say. But unity is obviously. That's what the church is called to, and that's what we're supposed to do. Sometimes there's unwise ways of getting things done that allow people to feel part of the body that otherwise they would be discounted, right? And so if you'd all just let me get this done, it'll get done. But if I do it, then this other person is not able to participate and not able to feel like they're, contributing to the body. And that's not a good thing either. And so I think erring on unity is better. But boy, the practical side of me struggles with that mightily.
Yeah, because it's going to slow down the process. It might not be efficient by certain definitions. You're not cutting through all the chatter, as people often say. People are like, committees are a horrible thing a horrible method to get things done, because you just get bogged down in the conversation. But the conversation is an important part, because you took out the word wisdom. I'm like, why did you do that? Because I think that the unity and wisdom are together. Like when people work things out as a community, yes, it might take time and it might slow down the process. Maybe it's not efficient from a temporal point of view, but it's through that process that you find wisdom. And the wisdom of the group is far superior than the wisdom that one person brings to the conversation, which once again forces us to ask questions about ourselves and all that. And so the arrogant person who wants to get his way is like, well, I'm as wiser than the rest of you, and so you should just do it my way. But the group says, but you're leaving things out. Here's something to think about. So I think that unity brings wisdom that brings about better results. That would be my response to that.
Yeah, to me, there's no contest. It's got to be unity, and our church tries to do this, right? But for us, it's better to do. There are two options. One is what we think is the best option, and the other is like second best. So it's still viable. It's not anti-scriptural. It's just not the best. Maybe it's not the most efficient or whatever. But it's better to be unified on the second best than to go forward divided, having chosen the best or the most efficient. But partly it's a false choice, because if you go forward in unity, or if you go forward with the best choice in disunity, that's going to be far less efficient in the long run, because now you got to do damage control for all the people you alienated
That's a good point.
in dividing. So it becomes, the efficient thing is to prioritize the unity. But it's a temptation for a lot of us, because so many aspects of our job life and even our home life, we have to be efficient. Like to get everything we need to get done for our world to work, we have to be efficient with certain things. The life of the body is just not one of those things that we can do without running over people.
And I've been in those situations in the past where I've run over people, and I look back with such regret, thinking I was doing the right thing, but oh my gosh, there's just this whole line of bodies, in my wake, and I've prayed for those people. It's like, God, I realize the mistakes I've made, and they're carrying the wounds of those mistakes, and I can't change the past, but I know I want to do things differently. It's like I don't want to be that person anymore. I want to be a better member of the body. And so I think that level of self-awareness to go, yeah, I've made mistakes. Yep, we've all done it. But we can make a choice now to do things differently and not just repeat that same old pattern over and over again.
So Ron's walk-up song is "Let the Bodies Hit the Floor" is what I'm, is what I'm hearing.
Been done to death.
That's a great song.
Every wrestling tournament of my entire life, that song is the walkout song.
Little drowning pool. Huh?
Yeah. So my bias based on my experience, was revealed in my initial phrasing of the question. What I found in the church is that we have incredible wisdom about how to manage resources, and we have very little wisdom about how to, quote unquote, manage people, which is that's the difficulty. That's the tension that you find. So in the field that I'm kind of representing, not that all three of these other guys that are sitting here are not active ministers, but the scholarly area that I represent is the field of ministry. And in my experience and in my training within the field of ministry, you often are faced with a choice. Do you grow your church by alienating people within the congregation so that you can move quickly and get things done? And you figure, we're going to alienate 50 people in the congregation, but we'll add 200 new people by the end of the year. Math checks out. Let's keep moving. Or do you commit yourself to the work of unity, quote unquote, remain small and quote unquote, not get things done? Like, it's a real tension within the field of ministry to balance. What does it mean to pursue unity? And at what point do you just pull the trigger on a strategy that you know is going to cause people to leave your church, but you know that you're going to add more people than you lost? And who's reconciling those books and that math? That's a choice that's being made just about everywhere in the church right now. And speak to our area, right? The English-speaking West. The tension is the sociological strategies that are effective to get people in the door of your church, attracting them to certain programs or methodologies at the cost of certain things that are going to cause other people to leave who might have the recognition that those things are not leading to the kind of, I don't want to fill in that blank. This is the tension. This is the tension in ministry. And so I pose this question in class in part because I just want to get that conversation rolling, but also it seems like the church has a distinct call to be unified and to be faithful. And there's something about trusting the results to God. And so if we're sort of re-engaging the spiritual discipline of submission, what does it look like to submit the results, the efficiency-based results, to God and just pursue the thing that we've been tasked with? And if what we've been tasked to do is be unified, and what we've been tasked to do is be faithful, is it an act of submission to just pursue those things and say, God, if this church is going to grow by 1,000 people this year, I guess you're going to have to do it. We're going to do these things you've told us to do.
Yeah, I was just thinking as you talked about, the work of the church in relation to efficiency, and it made me think about God. Like, if we were to characterize God's approach to salvation history, is God very efficient?
Not very.
Is his strategy very efficient? Like, I think it would have been much more efficient to send Jesus to replace Israel and to do Israel's job for Israel, and and get a band of angels and go around and get things done. But he doesn't. He gathers Israel. He gathers a remnant of Israel. They peaked numerically a long time ago, and now the remnant he's gathering is down to 12 and then being built back up slowly. And God is patient and long suffering. Yeah. And I'm trying to think, Sam, Ron, and Todd, you have, are there adjectives where God is described as being efficient, or like God and time where God is?
No, it's always the opposite.
Yeah.
Like, God is not slow as you think, but he's patient, right? He's doing these other things. I just think story after story, especially the Old Testament, where God is the most inefficient as possible. Like, I think Jericho. If you think about Jericho,
Right,
we're going to walk around the city once a day for 6 days, and then we're going to walk around it for 7 times. Like, what are you talking about right now? Just blow the thing up. Let's move on with life. Nope, that's not what we're doing, right? Because it's all about formation. It's all about, trust and faith and becoming the kind of people God wants us to be. And I think that's part of what submission is doing the inefficient thing in order to become more like who God wants us to be.
Yeah, God's always playing the long game, the really long game, longer than our own lifetimes and generations of lifetimes. And if God is willing to play the long game, why are we so impatient? God, just tell me what to do. I'll be faithful with it, and I'll let you handle the details. And so, placing a higher priority of programs and things like that over people. I know you're going to lose people from time to time. That does happen, but we don't have to lose them because we're abusing, our positions of authority. It's like, that's not who we are. When we're investing in people, sometimes we'll say, you're too valuable to me. I'll put this aside for now because I don't want to lose you. Keep investing in those people.
want to make a quick statement, observation, and then ask a question. So one of the things I talk about in class is submitting without submitting, which is obviously intended to be oxymoronic. The disciples are submit to the arrest when they are preaching the gospel in Acts, and then they go in and they say, "Yeah, we're just not going to stop. I know we're supposed to submit to governing authorities, but you've told us to stop preaching the gospel, and we're not going to." So their submission to the ruling authorities is they don't then turn around and try and depose the ruling authorities because they're trying to prevent the work of the gospel. They just go about the work of the gospel, staying in their lane, proclaiming and doing the things they're supposed to do. And the governing authorities do what they're supposed to do. And if they handle that responsibility poorly for long enough, God has promised to do something about that. So there is a sense in which they are not submitting while they are submitting, and those things get held in tension. So quick comment. Let's move to the next thing. We need to get really practical as we wrap up. So I would suspect there is more than one person who's hearing this episode going, okay, so how do I tell? How do I tell the difference between, what are the limits of submission? How do I know, is this a moment when I need to lay down my preferences? Or quite frankly, am I being abused or taken advantage of? Like, how can I tell?
Great question.
I would encourage them to, well, God, I was about to say, I still think this is true, but I can also see where this goes off the rails, so I apologize for that. But I think part of it is not trying to decide by yourself. Obviously we read the Bible, we pray, we listen to the Holy Spirit, but, having conversations, not with just anybody because it becomes gossip, but to have conversations with others whom we respect in the Lord to say, this is what I'm thinking. Can we talk it through? It comes back to that idea of really, community interpretation. And so to say, am I submitting properly? Am I being abused? How do I understand this situation? Like I said, have it with people that I think are people we respect in the Lord, and it's not just gossiping to whoever that goes off the rails, but having good conversations with people we respect, and then moving on from there.
I don't know. It's a struggle because on the one hand, I mean, there's certain things where if someone in a position of authority tells us to do something that is contradicting the Bible, I feel like we shouldn't do that. But I'm thinking like the disciples. They're told not to preach. They did, but they submitted to the arrest, which is unjust. But then they went out and still preached. And so I don't know how that works. And I think about also like a woman in a marriage. So submitting to the marriage and staying married is one thing, but not putting herself in a place where she's being abused or he's being abused, that's not okay either. So on the one hand, it's like, I'm going to stay committed to this marriage, but I'm not going to be in a place where I'm going to be abused. So how do you do that? How do you stay committed to a marriage without being in a place where you're abused? I don't know. But I don't think the person should allow the abuse either.
Yeah, the apostles are a great example because they're recognizing their place in relation to God. They have a mandate. They're his servant.
Mm-hmm.
He's above the governing authorities who are telling them to shut up. And so they're submitting to God first.
Right.
But they're also submitting to when these authorities who are under God are misusing their authority to forbid them to preach the gospel. Well, they're submitting to God and not them in their preaching. But when they come to arrest them, they also stick their hands out and say, all right, haul me away to jail. And I entrust myself this unjust treatment that I'm receiving to God. But when they did that, that was not destroying their life.
Right.
Like they were supported by a community of prayer. They had the company of one another. They were just not like allowing themselves to be wasted away by their oppressors. Like they had community and joy in fellowship and suffering where it was a positive testimony. Their submission to God despite concurrent with their submission to the governing authorities, right? And so I think Ron's, advice, I think, entrust yourself to some Christians to help you say, you know what, this person is asking me to do something and they've been given responsibility. I'm under them and I feel like it's kind of degrading to me, right? And is this the kind of degrading that I suffer under and try to be a positive witness to and like overcome their evil with good? Is this that kind of situation? Or is this there's no positive witness here. They're just degrading me and getting away with it. And at this point, the faithful thing is to cry out about the injustice. Cry out to God, cry out to my neighbors, cry out to the community. I think if there's any criteria, it's got to be the discernment of a praying community, because there is a time to turn the other cheek, right, and to overcome evil with good, and there is a time to someone else has to hold me up and help me in this situation because it's not fair and I'm getting devoured, and that can't be God's will.
It makes me think of like in Revelation where, John has this vision of, the souls of those who have been martyred, and they're crying out to God for justice. It's like, we want justice here. And God says, okay, you're going to have to wait a little while, but justice does come. These people who are horribly abusing you, i.e. the Roman authorities, God does bring them to justice. But sometimes you have to, turn it over to God. You got to cry out, God, this is horrible. And God says, you're right, it is horrible. And I will take care of it. It doesn't always play out that way, but there might be situations where God becomes our only source of vindication and justice. But I think you're right. Being a part of a discerning body is a really important part of that. We're not called to do this alone. It's not just you and God, but God brings people into our lives that we can trust and have those conversations with, pray together and seek God together and discern the best way forward. There's not a single answer, but it's going to vary from situation to situation.
Yeah, and I think the body of Christ is a good context for that appeal, because there are people in the body that understand there is a godly place for submission that causes us pain and is uncomfortable. And this might be one of those. And there's also people who are like, yeah, this kind of submission isn't right. This isn't accepting the right place of, who's been given responsibility in the order. This is someone who is on a power trip that's abusing people, right? Your advisors should be people who believe there is a time and place, right, for a certain kind of submission. And if our advisors are only those who, any infringement upon my freedom is always abuse and oppression, for them there's never going to be a time when you shouldn't be resisting. There's never a time to submit. And it shouldn't be advisors who are always like, yep, just take the hit every time. Like, it needs to be people who, given the situation, would encourage a godly submission of overcoming evil with good, and those who would say, no, there's nothing godly about allowing them to do this to you. It needs to be the right group.
Yeah, one of the deficient teachings that we referenced earlier from Foster's quote is that there is a one-size-fits-all answer to submission. It is deficient to try and create one criterion or criteria that say this is exactly how it works every single time. Two remarkably similar situations could have different faithful responses, and I think that's appropriate. One suggestion we can close, the phrase that I use in class, that because I want to give something as practical as I can. I think what you said is practical, but this phrase is sticky. The point at which something becomes unredemptively destructive is the point at which you should consider abandoning submission. Unredemptively destructive. And I think that it takes a group to help discern that. There's a lot that goes into that. But destructive is a word that you used. I totally agree with that there is a kind of destruction that doesn't honor God. And submission is about honoring God, finding our right place. And if we're just walking into destruction for no reason, I don't think anyone, including God, is being honored by that.
That's a nice pairing. Unredemptively destructive.
All right. Well, hopefully we covered it. If not, we can have further conversation, perhaps even online.
There you go.
Until then, thanks for joining us this episode of the After Class Podcast.
After class, because
The best conversations happen
After class.
Thank you again for listening to this episode of the After Class Podcast. ACP is hosted by Sam Long, John Nugent, and Ron Peters. Social media pictures and descriptions are provided by Darren Harris. Audio mixing and editing is done by Drew Nyquist. If you've enjoyed this episode of ACP, you might also enjoy GLCC's Master of Arts in Practical Theology degree. In this 36-hour program, you will receive first-rate biblical and theological instruction from John, Ron, Sam, and several of their colleagues at Great Lakes Christian College. To learn more about this program, visit glcc.edu. Get practical and go deep at GLCC.